The Soldier.
Oh, fuck you. Just leave.
Bennett watched the police cruiser pass the duplex on the corner as it searched the place top to bottom for a third time. The officer was down to 5 miles per hour, but still unable to spot him in his hiding place.
Yes, please. Go.
When another few minutes went by without a sighting, Bennett finally let his shoulders down and slumped over the steering wheel of his 2005 Ford, its 8-cylinder diesel idling like a growling West Indian tiger. Putting his baby in neutral, he looked around the random garage he'd backed into, attached to an alley amid a maze of service roads, most of which didn't show up on any map. Its walls were lined with boxes, fishing poles, and beer signs. Not a bad place to lay low for a while. Sometimes dumb shit like this was necessary to avoid jail time, a lesson he'd learned in a dozen instances witnessing his father pull similar dumb shit.
The true master of the lie.
Bennett would probably get away today, as well as use this trick again in the future to avoid yet another cop.
Though I'm giving less and less of a shit each time I do.
The only reason he was being forced to hide in the garage like a common criminal in the first place was because he'd failed to signal a lane change and slammed on his brakes.
Thought I saw an IED. It happens.
It would have been easy to oblige the traffic officer, pull over, and play nice, but everything about Bennett stunk to high heaven at the moment, and not just his breath and armpits. Today, he was driving angry, and with many reasons not to pull over, knowing full well he'd cashed in all of his good karma chips following his last offense 3 weeks ago. The unfortunate incident involved the destruction of private property and the deaths of 8 chickens from a local egg farm.
To be fair, who puts a chicken coop so close to the fucking road?
The county judges and higher ups at the police were nothing if not flag waving, vet loving Americans. Good people infatuated enough with the idea of Bennett's service as to let it cloud their judgment.
The type of folks who'd say, thank you for your service, and have no idea what the hell they're really thanking you for.
He'd been let off the hook many times, but the galled look on Judge Ryandot's face after the chicken coop incident unmistakably proved Bennett's days of leniency were numbered. Seemed the community had had enough of him and his vapid bullshit. Drunk and disorderly calls, public urination, things of that nature.
Bar fights are my specialty.
Throwing his weight around was one of his favorite pastimes. In between volunteering at the recruitment office at the mall, playing video games in his apartment, and dragging the streets of Tempe for special company. All of which he had ample time for, being unemployed the previous 13 months following a failed stint as a car wash custodian. So far, no one in the housing complex had noticed him, or his truck, or seemed to care enough to make a verbal fuss about his confiscation of the garage. Surprising, considering how many were willing to call the cops on someone who looked like a crotchety UFC fighter whose shoulders and back were covered almost entirely in ink. The most prominent tattoo had been done in a pencil sketch style of a tulip on his right arm, strung around a Marine Corps crest. When an additional 4 minutes of cop-free streets passed, Bennett turned off the Ford's engine and took out the keys. Sitting back, exhausted and thirsty, he reached for a bottle-shaped paper bag in the passenger seat. Popping the top, he drank like a fish, leaving a good bit of whiskey on his thick beard and chest.
All right, what are my options?
No way he could drive away now. The Ford stuck out like a sore thumb, and his name and license plate were likely all over town. In addition, the cops weren't the only ones after him at the moment. Today was turning out to be fucking stupid. Grabbing the bottle, he opened the door and stepped down, knowing the scream would return. Using the truck's handrails for support, he descended, ignoring his bad right knee shrieking like an old, ugly ant who'd just woken up from a nap. It was an angry war wound that refused to leave him alone for even a second. The pain even followed him into his dreams.
I limp there too. It's annoying.
Ducking out of the garage into the alley, he crossed the street and hurried toward a local soda shop, Jack's Sodas and Cream Cafe. The alley in the rear of the shop had been Bennett's usual hangout since he was 15, when his family moved to Prescott from Waco, Texas, so his dad could start a business.
Though I'd personally call it a fraud factory. Loser.
There were plenty of stacks of crates and trash cans. Some good stoops for stooping, too. Reaching the spot where he could still see Main Street, he stumbled, landing with concrete in his spine, and laughed with complacency. a forfeit of self-respect. Lying back on his elbows, he drank, watching the families go about their day on Main Street, their stupid faces and smiles making him want to puke.
Fucking consumer whores, ignoring everything going on above them, pretending shit's taken care of.
The afternoon came and went as Bennett waited for the cover of nightfall to make his escape, and the bottle was soon empty. Not a soul had come or gone, except for a teenage employee of the soda shop with glasses, who stepped out to throw boxes into the dumpster, then spotted him, inexplicably said, "Sorry," and hightailed it back inside. 2 hours of peace and quiet had gone by since. When shuffling feet came scraping up the alley, Bennett's head was buried in his folded arms over his knees. Through a gap, he could see worn loafers and tattered slacks approaching, and hoped whoever it was would ignore him and move on.
Why is solace so hard to find?
But the worn sneakers planted themselves firmly in front of him. "Mind if I sit?" an old sandpaper voice asked. The shape leaned to block the blinding sun, revealing a wrinkled smile aimed Bennett's way. The bearded vagrant wore a gray knitted cap with 2 brown stripes, above gray puffs of hair poking out over his ears, which seemed large enough to glide with. An olive green, double-breasted, twill trench coat he wore, riddled with holes, rested over a lighter jacket, which may have been near white at some point. His hands were rested on a wooden cane with a shaft made of dark wood, topped with an emerald green stone which seemed to radiate a faint glow from within. "I don't have any change," Bennett said immediately. The old man shook his head. "Don't want any. Too heavy." "Then what do you want?" "Lots of stuff." Bennett half laughed and buried his head in his arms again, expecting the vagrant to vamoose, but there was no crunching gravel. "Is it too much to ask to be alone?" Bennett said. "Helps calm me down." "Not at all," the vagrant replied, taking a seat next to him.
And people call me tone deaf.
Bennett's anger was all but spent. He let it go. As long as the guy didn't talk, he didn't care. He just wanted to think. They sat in silence for nearly 5 minutes before the old vagrant was chuckling out of nowhere. "Sorry," he tittered. "Thought of something funny." The next silence only lasted a moment, before the old man was giggling again, then laughing to himself. Soon, he was cackling so loudly it echoed down the alley. Bennett took a glance around, not getting the joke. "What's your problem?" The vagrant reached into his breast pocket, revealing a worn green notebook with a chewed wooden pencil tucked into its weathered pages. He wrote something down, excited and chuckling the entire time. Once finished, he put the book back in his pocket and returned to sitting in silence, as though nothing had happened. "I don't care if you're crazy or whatever," Bennett said. "I don't. Just leave me alone. It's not the day." "What's not the day?" the vagrant asked, cheerily untouched. "Do I look like the kind of guy you want to piss off?" Bennett asked, not expecting an answer. "Not sure, to tell you the truth. You people all started to look alike after a while."
"That does it."
Bennett struggled to stand, his anger flowing, ready to take everything out on this poor dumbass who'd wandered into the wrong alley and fucked with the wrong guy. Leaning on his good knee, he reached for the vagrant's throat. "An Englishman, an Irishman, and a Scotsman are stranded on a desert island," the vagrant yelled, as if it were an incantation, his hands up, hurling the quip. The soldier found himself dumbfounded. In all his years of combat, he'd never seen a defense quite like this. His repertoire had nothing to offer the situation. He stepped back and waited. The vagrant continued. "One day, the Englishman comes across a bottle with a cork in it buried in the sand. He tries to read the label because, who knows, might be worth a drink, right? But it's dirty, so he starts rubbing it to clean it up. Suddenly, guess what happens? Cork flies off, and poof, out pops a genie, who promises to grant them each one wish as a way of saying, 'Thanks for getting me out of that friggin' bottle.' The Englishman was the one to rub him out, so he gets the first wish, and wishes he was back in his local pub, a cold pint in hand, a beautiful woman in the other, and his foot on the telly. The genie says great, claps his hands, and the Englishman disappears. Next is the Scotsman. He thinks hard and says he wishes he was back home in his favorite chair with his feet up and a nice haggis waiting for him. Once again, the genie claps his hands and the Scotsman is whisked away. The genie then turns to the Irishman and asks, "So, young man, with this one wish, what do you desire more than anything?" The Irishman looks up at the genie, seeming very upset, and says, "I'm so lonely. I wish my friends were back here with me." The vagrant opened his arms, as though he'd just performed a trick. A long moment passed where a cold wind blew and a beige sedan drove by, before Bennett smirked and tried to take a drink of whiskey, having forgotten the bottle was dry. "Pretty funny." The old man tucked a puzzled finger under his tattered beard. "That one's usually a killer. Heard it from a fella a few dimes ago. Been my go-to ever since. I'm still hoping one day I can write a joke as good. How about you? You have one?" "One what?" Bennett asked. "Favorite joke." "Do I look like it?" "People will surprise you." "I hate surprises," Bennett said. "Besides, these days, in this country, there's nothing worth laughing at. It all leads to bullshit eventually, right? Life's like a revolving joke." "I've considered something similar many times," said the vagrant. "But it seems too base, I think. That'll do." Reaching into his left jacket pocket, he revealed a fresh bottle of whiskey, same brand as Bennett's original, and held it out with a wrinkled smile. "Look, we could get into a pissing match about who's got it worse between the two of us, or we could get drunk and be miserable together. Your choice." A shot rang through Bennett. He'd heard those words before.
Miserable together. Yeah. Lance used to say that to me every time we'd get shit-faced after a mission.
He saw his squad mate, Mark Lance, in his mind, telling jokes and doing hand magic. Then he saw his pale white face as he lay in his casket at his wake.
Pills. Fucking tragedy. Goddamn VA.
He didn't want to think of Mark. Bennett just wanted a drink. "My man." He took the bottle from the vagrant and sat down to pop it open. "You know, when I walked into this alley, I wasn't expecting to see a vet drinking himself into the gutter," the old vagrant said, taking the bottle back for a nip. "Is there a better place to drink myself into? Shower never hurt anybody. Coming from you? Got me there." The vagrant handed the bottle back and wiped his gray beard, then took a breath, as though to prepare to say something he'd been dwelling on. "What a world. Days like today really make you wonder, don't they?" "I don't wonder anymore," Bennett replied. "That's amazing," said the vagrant. "I've never found a way to silence that voice asking why. No matter how many veils I pull back, the answer is always one step ahead of me." He looked up at the clouds as he finished, carrying a deep, arid sadness about him. Bennett felt sorry for the guy.
He looks the way I feel. Starting to think he's seen some shit.
"Me personally, I think this world is a festering wound." The old vagrant laughed. "Yes, it's hard not to. But wounds heal, as long as there's life. Keep that in the back of your mind." With that, he closed the bottle. "I think that's enough. Fellas like us gotta ration things like this. Make it last." Bennett scoff-laughed again. "What do you... I'm not homeless." "Then what are you doing here?" "Just 'cause I can't go home doesn't mean I don't have one." "So what's the difference between you and me?" the vagrant asked. "Fuck semantics, man. You know what I mean." "In actuality, no. There is no difference. We're both just heaps of meat, fucking over other heaps of meat, all for shitty profit. Makes me want to scream." "You got a couple of screws loose, don't you?" the vagrant laughed and snorted.
Damn it, I'm starting to like this guy.
"You know what your problem is, son? You see everything as us versus them. It's terribly acidic. Trust me, nothing is ever cut and dried. There are levels." "Things are pretty cut and dry where I come from," Bennett said. "It's kill or be killed. No way around it."
Maybe I don't like him.
The vagrant sounded frustrated, as though there was a point he was trying to get across, but he just couldn't land it. "That's sometimes true, and sometimes not. Not to sound indelicate, but you appear in desperate need of a bath and a massage, my friend. Why don't you head home and cool down? Have a good meal. Rest. You've obviously had a heck of a day. Cops had my place tagged last I checked. Might even be an official crime scene by now. Figured vacating was smart. I see. You rob a bank or something? Assault, Bennett said solemnly. Oh dear. Against whom? Her name is Autumn. Working name is, at least. Maybe was. Not sure. I assume it was all a misunderstanding. Or you acted in defense. An accident, perhaps? Nope. She was innocent. Sounds like you got yourself into something very thick, young man, the vagrant said, sounding disappointed. I know. I said I didn't want to talk about. I lost my shit. It was a bad day. And she kept yelling. I asked her to go. I could feel it coming, you know? I get these moments, flashes of utter rage. It's so much that I feel like I can't take it. I need to break whatever is near me. For fuck's... Bennett's hands were shaking. His head was pounding. She just kept coming at me about money. And I tried to explain. And I snapped. I put her down. She fell into the cabinet. I'm still not even sure she got back up. I just lashed out. It was so hard. My fucking hand. Bennett's words were fumbling. I called the ambulance. Got out of there. Now I'm here with you, avoiding everyone, including a pimp I've never met before and desperately don't want to. A space was left, a silence that let him catch his breath. You know, thinking about it, I can honestly say I've never once crossed a pimp, the vagrant said jovially. You've got me on that one. Maybe because I've never been one for personal contact. Fuck, why'd you say that so nice? I don't deserve it. What do you deserve then? Prison, or probably hell at this point, Bennett said. Awful steep, don't you think? You don't know my crimes, or me. Does using the H word imply you believe in life after death? Because otherwise, you got nothing to worry about. The vagrant's tone was so easygoing you'd think he was discussing the weather. I don't. At least, I don't think I do, Bennett answered. Sometimes I wish there was life after death, but we'd have to know about it. That it exists, you know? The whole truth. This going in blind crap isn't working. What do you mean? People and their blind faith. Makes them act shitty because they think imaginary things are real. What we saw in war or battle, whatever, me and my guys, we did so much for this country. For those people. He said, pointing at the citizens walking and shopping on Main Street. They praised some invisible man before ever thanking us. Then they come pick at my friends' funerals, saying they died because God wanted them to, because they deserved it. Makes me sick. None of us are decent. Yeah, I hope hell is real. We all deserve to go. The old vagrant sat wide-eyed, bulged his cheeks, and let out a burst of air. Wow, that is a new perspective. Thank you. He then patted Bennett on the back, as though to say, Great job, kiddo. So let's say it is real, all of it, the whole religious shebang, and all the horrible punishments waiting for us beyond the grave. Even then, you're still a young man, what, 34? Plenty of time to right your wrongs. It's not like you killed someone. I've killed more people than I know, Bennett said, stone-faced. Every single one of them someone's brother, or sister, or kid. Most of them never even saw their faces. And for the record, I'm 36. Sounds like we've both seen our fair share of war, the vagrant said with an identical air, gathering a suspicious stare from Bennett. Don't think I got it in me? Death seems to follow me wherever I go. Because of it, I've done more unspeakable things than I can even remember. Then how do you know you did them? The vagrant sighed with the weight of more years than Bennett cared to guess. Because I remember how I felt each time. Silenced, Bennett searched for a new subject. Which branch were you in? The vagrant's brow tightened as if confused. You know, Navy, Marines. Oh, right, gotcha. None. I guess you'd say it was an offshoot branch. Try me, Bennett pressed. No, son, pretty sure you've never heard of us. We were a small group. Not really warriors in the strictest sense, more facilitators. Of war? Bennett asked. Of peace. That was the idea, anyway. The vagrant finished with a tired grin. Funny how many people we have to kill to stop all the killing, huh? Bennett added. For once, the vagrant had no remark. He simply smiled as one does after they hear a joke that makes them think of a dark memory but don't want to ruin the fun for the others, so they keep it to themselves. Bennett wanted to save them both the embarrassment and changed the subject again. Tell me why you seem so familiar. Have we been drunk in an alley together before? No, I've only been in town a few weeks. Maybe I just have one of those faces. Why, is something wrong? The vagrant asked. Bennett shook his head. Just deja vu. Hate the stuff. Using his cane for support, the vagrant stood with a groan. There's nothing I can do about that. There's nothing much I can do about any of this. And yet, here we are. But I want you to know something, young man. When I set foot in this alley, it was because of a choice. Same as you. Where you go when you leave here, that's a choice. Sometimes it seems like the world is nothing but a bunch of choices running into each other, colliding and sending everybody in completely different directions from where they started. It's maddeningly unpredictable. And yet, after all my years, I'm still not sure who makes them. Is it really us, the players, or is it something else? I just don't know. In fact, I'm to the point that I don't really give a hoot. I'll play along, fuck it. But what I want to see more than anything is one choice that straightens it all out, like planets aligning. Even if just for a second. That would be true beauty. If I could just see that, it would all be worth it. His sandpaper voice trailed off, sounding weary, like an idealist whose candle was close to being put out by the rain. Bennett shook his head. Universe ain't my problem. I got plenty of those already. A bunch of assholes who sit in front of computers all day put me on meds for my knee that they knew fucked people up, then hung me out to dry when I refused to take them. And this whole society has done nothing but give me shit for what we did for them. I mean, I can't even walk around like an upright, fully formed person.
Where is this coming from?
Bennett couldn't help unloading on the old stranger. You want to talk about choices? How about the people who don't get to make them for themselves? Taking orders all day. Nobody ever gives a shit about them. Nobody ever asks what they want. The vagrant smiled like a proud grandpa and handed Bennett the bottle. Here, keep it. Good talk, son. Peace be with you and all that. Pulling down his gray knitted cap with 2 brown stripes, he gave a respectful nod and walked back the way he'd come. I'm glad I got to meet you in this life. Remember, the world is made of choices, and a bath and a meal can work wonders. What do you mean this life? Bennett shouted, but the vagrant had already disappeared around the brick corner, leaving him alone to contemplate their conversation.
Never even got his name.
He was sure he'd seen him before. There was something familiar, almost comforting, about the scruffy vagrant, and for several minutes Bennett couldn't stop replaying his last words in his mind.
Why did he say this life?
When his wristwatch beeped, signaling the hour, Bennett snapped to. The day was getting late, and his baby would not stay safe much longer. Hurrying across the street to the open garage, he climbed into his truck, took 3 sloppy attempts to get the key in the ignition before starting the engine, and somehow convinced himself he was sober enough to make it safely out of town. Taking his foot off the brake, he hoped for the best and made his way south, past Main Street, to Highway 89, into a stretch of barren desert. Proud of himself for drifting only a little, he was soon 20 miles outside of town, in the clear.
Cops only come out here if someone calls them.
By sundown, his truck was kicking pillows of dust into the day's remaining light, casting the dimming sky on fire. As darkness swept over the valley, the truck rolled onto a dirt lot in front of a rustic, abandoned gas station. None of its original vintage pumps remained, having been stolen years ago, much to Bennett's chagrin, mostly because he'd had no idea they were valuable and would have sold them himself if he had. The truck's headlights swooped over the building and its connected auto garage, falling on the main entrance. He parked and left the engine running and lights on, illuminating the weeds wrapping their way through every crevice and broken window, giving the station the visage of a sunken ship within the dark depths of the sea. His thoughts drifted to what it might look like if he decided to put the Ford in gear and tear through the whole goddamn thing.
Probably fun as hell.
But the damage it would do to his truck was not worth it.
True.
The Ford was all he had left in the world, other than the deed to the dirt beneath the station. Stepping down from the cab, he found the paper bag-wrapped bottle of whiskey was still in his hands, though he couldn't remember picking it up, and tossed it back into the cab. Approaching the station entrance, he pulled out his keyring from his pocket. He opened the first two locks but paused before opening the third, not knowing for sure why, and turned around. The blinding headlights made it impossible to see anything but the deep blue sky above, fading quickly to black and revealing a starry Arizona night. "Hello?" he called, answered only by his truck's purring engine. Turning the last key, Bennett entered the station and shut the door behind him. Hard streams of light from his truck pierced through the station's shattered windows, tinted a slight blue in the lingering air. He limped past the clerk counter and fallen shelves, over rotten wood cracking under his weight, past mountains of boxes and stacks of files, into the rear of the station and the corner office. Its door was ornamented with a skewed nameplate reading, "Mr. Hunter, owner and operator." A coyote's howl in the distance broke the silence, snapping Bennett to attention as he opened the door that was half hanging on one hinge.
Not in the fucking mood, dog.
The rest of the station was a mess worthy of a flamethrower or a hand grenade, but this room had been preserved perfectly. A thin layer of dust blanketed every inch. Bennett lifted his right leg, letting his boot hover over the entry, closed his eyes, and messed the first bit of dust on the floor. Moving to the wall on the left, he looked over the rows of plaques and custom frames decorating it. Most contained certificates of excellence from local newspapers, hedge fund managers, and even a few of the companies his father had defrauded. All were dated at least 30 years ago. When everything,
inevitably,
came crashing down, and the Hunter family was left with nothing, the plaques were left, as though an attempt by Bennett's father, Tony, to keep up appearances and pretend the business was as legitimate and profitable as ever, and not propped up on faulty repairs with counterfeit parts and a thinly veiled aftermarket warranty scheme. Below the main cluster, a wooden frame hung tilted, covered with spiderwebs. A black and white photo resided inside. In it, a picturesque nuclear family stood in front of the store, the way it had once looked in its prime. Bushes trimmed, windows clean, aromatically fresh paint.
Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. Hi, Jer.
His father was dressed in a finely pressed suit, next to their immaculate mother, with the two boys, aged 9 and 14, standing on either side of them. The older boy, with a thinner jaw and dressed in a fitted suit, carried the same stern guise as the father, while the younger, the stockier of the two, beamed sarcastically, missing most of his baby teeth, clutching a wooden sword and shield.
Do what you can, King Arthur. That's what Jerry used to say to me. That will always be enough.
Bennett tried to hear his older brother say the words, but could no longer remember what his voice sounded like, nor his mother's. The only voice he could remember was his father's.
Either shouting or whispering so intensely you'd wish he were shouting.
Stepping away from the photos, Bennett flung the brown leather chair that lay behind the desk in a circle. Its rusted joints screamed as it rotated, forcing it to a quick stop. He spun it again, sending the chair screeching to the same position. He forced it harder, 2 spins this time. Again, harder still. The chair's screams ran through the halls and back through the shattered glass on the station floor. Bennett sat, avoiding the exposed springs, his eyes fixed on the photo amid the certificates, specifically on him and Jerry, sharing their father's wide nose and stout forehead.
What's it been, Jer? 16? 17 years?
Saliva drained from his lips onto his beard as he gazed, his eyelids hanging heavy and uneven. The second drawer handle was soon gripped in his hand. Without taking his eyes off the photo, Bennett set what was inside the drawer on the desk. In the light of the truck headlights, the cold gray steel of a 1964 U.S. military-issue revolver reflected like smooth charcoal. Taking up the weapon, he aimed it at the photo. Son, what good's a gun if it's not loaded? You thinking straight? Bennett lowered his tone, matching his father's, and pulled back the hammer. You a man like your brother? A little man fucking faggot? Or are you a man like a man? Huh? He squeezed the trigger, and the gun went off with a thunderous bang, lighting the room with a flash, mussing the dust on the desk. The bullet tore into the lower corner of the photo.
Reliable 64, right, Dad?
He fired again. Do you know what to do when someone refuses to stop causing trouble? The blast tore open the opposite corner as the gun fired on repeat, and he lost count of how many bullets were left in the cylinder. In his mind, Bennett was screaming, letting the anger escape into his veins, but on the outside, he was as silent as the night. The photos on the wall dripped splinters, reduced to chunks dangling by wires. His finger caressed the trigger. His jaw shook so violently it sent quakes through his whole body. To Bennett, it all felt like a sign. There were no options. There was nowhere to go.
What if I'm the one who won't stop causing trouble, Dad?
He fought to hear Jerry's voice, not his father's.
Why can't I remember what he sounded like? He'd know what to do. He'd know what to say. He always did.
A real man always knows what to do, you little shit, Bennett repeated in his father's voice, as though possessed by the spirit of Tony Hunter, suddenly surprised to find the cold barrel of the gun resting against his temple.
Really? We're doing this again?
Bennett wanted to laugh at himself. Nothing ever came of episodes like this. Most likely, he would wake up in the morning with nothing more than a hangover and regret. But when his mouth opened, he released a sound he never knew he was capable of making. A moan of pain and regret escaped, with so much raw emotional force he thought he might burst like a water balloon. The dam was broken, and he was facing it with nothing but fear, feeling smaller and smaller every second. Shaking, he gripped the handle and held his breath.
Tell you what, Dad. If there's one left in the chamber, it's on me.
With a sudden clarity, real or imaginary, Bennett closed his eyes and pulled the trigger.